There we go. Well, good morning, everybody. We're here with Bruce Rawles and Lynn Johnson. And oh, thank you, Renee. She's telling us that everything's being heard as well. Bruce Rawles and Lynn Johnson, and we're reading Absence from Felicity, which is, I'm so excited about this. And I know a lot of other folks are as well. But this is the story of, Ken Wapnick wrote about his experience with Helen Schucman and the scribing and the everything of the course, but so much more about the life of Helen. And for me, the reason that I wanted to read this book and actually reread this book is because uh, it's it's not just fascinating. A lot of people want to read it because it's fascinating to see how Helen uh, dealt with Jesus and with the scribing and all that. Uh, but I think it gives me a lot of insight, maybe into my own blocks and the things that are keeping me from seeing what what I need to see. And so, going on this walk with Ken and the scribe is exciting. And so, how are you doing, Bruce? What's up with you today?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. It's like, yeah, it's a fascinating story in itself, of course, on that level. But more importantly, I think, and I think the reason Ken wrote it, undoubtedly, was to basically show that Helen was really all of us, and that in terms of our resistance to the material, and yet at the same time, with from the ego's perspective, but at the same time, we're all drawn to the course, and certainly Helen was, even though there was obvious enormous resistance there, because we know that that's really our true identity, and that's really where we're all going. And so it's actually a happy inevitability once we begin to undo that resistance with Holy Spirit's help. And so yeah, I think the account really is useful on at least a couple of levels. Obviously the story itself is fascinating because it's the story of the curriculum that we're studying and practicing more and more, but more importantly it's exemplary of the process that we're all going through. And it's really all of our stories, right?
Yeah. So exciting, fun, and
Yeah.
so let's get started. Do you want to
Okay.
read?
Sure. Last week we our initial reading, we covered the preface, and now we're at the introduction, which in the print version is on page 7. If you have a print version of Absence from Felicity, the story of Helen Schucman and her scribing of A Course in Miracles by Kenneth Wapnick, Ph.D. We'll read the full title and author again for people just tuned in. And so now we're at the introduction, which is given the caption, "A middle-aged lawyer," in quotes. And Ken begins, "I first met Helen Schucman on Saturday night, November 25th, 1972. We met at William Thetford's apartment on the Upper East Side of New York City, and our meeting was arranged by our mutual friend, Father Michael. The three of them, along with Bill's roommate Chip, had spent the afternoon at a healing service of Catherine Kuhlman, the famous faith healer, and had been impressed, if not worn out, by the intense sincerity of the service. I later learned how unusual it was for Helen to agree to go out in the evening, especially after a tiring day. Looking back on that meeting, I can see a certain inevitability in the circumstances leading up to it. Brought up in a Jewish home and educated for the first 8 grades in a Hebrew parochial school called a yeshiva, I had left God and Judaism behind at the age of 13, determined never to think of religious issues again. There followed a long period of agnosticism that was coupled with a growing and passionate love for classical music, with Beethoven and Mozart heading my personal pantheon of guides that led me ever more deeply to internal experiences that I, in my ignorance during that period, scarcely would have termed spiritual. This period included my graduate education and, very surprisingly, a doctoral dissertation on St. Teresa of Avila, the famous 16th century Spanish mystic. A couple of years later, in 1970, after the breakup of my first marriage, God, quote, showed up, unquote, and I began to feel a personal presence that was behind these, quote, non-spiritual, unquote, experiences. 2 years later, myself visiting a Trappist monastery, the Abbey of Gethsemani in Kentucky, very unexpectedly feeling totally, quote, at home, unquote. So as we can see that, Ken is beginning to give a little personal account of the background, what led up to her meeting with Helen.
Yeah.
Any comments on that so far?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I do I have an extra line in my book, or did something I didn't the last sentence I didn't hear you read all of it. So
Oh, okay. The last one I said was
the one that starts
and with
"Please
the Abbey
pray."
of Gethsemane in Kentucky, very unexpectedly feeling totally at home. In quotes.
Okay, all right. So yeah, so this is really interesting because now we have some insight into Ken, that he was married and divorced, and had probably pretty strictly Jewish upbringing, but at the age of 13 he decided no more, which is really telling also, because that's a lot of times when people are mystic, that age of 13, 14
Mhm,
opens up something in them,
mhm.
besides general puberty. And I was wondering, as you were reading that, did Ken play any musical instrument? I don't think that he did, but maybe he did.
He did play a clarinet with a group in upstate New York when he had the center there, and he was very what's the term, not self-effacing, but there's another term that he basically played down his ability to play the clarinet, and deferred to the much superior quality of his two other um, uh, partners in this musical trio that he performed with, the Tenaya Lake trio, or something like that. Tanana Lake. Tenaya Lake is near Yosemite. I think it's Tanana Lake. Anyway, if I remember correctly, I'd have to go back and look at other things that I've.
So interesting. And I wonder
Yeah,
what music they
but
play.
he did enjoy playing the clarinet, but he considered himself an amateur. I oftentimes say similar things about a lot of my hobbies and interests. As I'm aspiring to be an amateur. That's kind of how I put things. But I know Ken probably was a passable clarinet player, but who knows? I never heard him play, or heard any recordings of it. Um, but the other two, more professional musicians, were happy to have him in their group. So I'm guessing he must have been adequate.
Well, it just seems so funny to me, because I'm sorry to be taking this other path here, but
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, we
fascinating.
typically do.
Yeah, that because when you said a trio and he played a saxophone, I'm thinking,
No,
or
clarinet.
played a
Clarinet,
clarinet. I'm
yeah.
thinking, was this a jazz trio, or
No, I think they played mostly classical
I was,
pieces.
yeah, how
I believe. Yeah.
very interesting. Well,
Yeah.
very cool.
Yeah.
Enough of
Yeah.
that. Um, so it's like
Well, at least that's my understanding. So,
yeah.
which is it's a
I
big
love
asterisk, question mark, subject to change without notice.
yeah, I think it's really interesting that he talks about that he was feeling a personal presence that was beyond non-spiritual experiences, and um, then went to a Trappist monastery, and I believe it was in Kentucky,
Mhm,
which I
mhm.
didn't even realize there was a Trappist monastery in Kentucky, but because that doesn't seem like Trappist monk territory. But I mean I mean interesting. But
Just
anyway,
goes to show that our expectations and generalizations, based on form, can be wildly off,
yeah,
which Ken points out very nicely in this book that we're just beginning to read. Is when Helen was trying to work from her own understanding, it inevitably is flawed, and sometimes hilariously so. Even I was just listening to a fellow course student who I'm not going to mention the name, but she and her partner put together an AI conversation with Jesus using kind of latest tech tools, and
everybody's doing that now.
it was kind of interesting. But again, it's like, what are you drawing from? I mean, since artificial intelligence basically is a friend of mine who's more technically savvy and current than I am, and a lot of that said, it's stochastic parrot, but it's basically, which is really kind of what the ego mind does, really. I mean, it's just, if you think of, we're training AI systems to mimic the functions of our egos a lot of the time, and what it said was actually pretty reasonable. It certainly wasn't strictly aligned with the course's metaphysics, but it was nice and interesting, and certainly for someone who wanted a not too religious perspective, sort of adequate. But anyway, but to me, the point is that we get sidetracked and derailed when we think that things that are coming from ourselves, as little s selves, are going to be adequate, when we have no basis for judgment, we have no basis for comprehension, using our own incredibly limited perspectives. And we need the bigger perspective of what the course calls Holy Spirit or Jesus to see us through, and to trust that, and learn to trust it implicitly. And I think that's why, again, this reading, I think is going to be helpful, because it really does say, give us an example of when Helen was tuned into that source and let the material flow through her, it was tremendously inspired and profoundly accurate on the level of the content of about the mind. On the level of form, there's very little about form or behavior. In fact, I will try to remind myself that when I pick up the course and I try to remember it's always and only about the mind, and in particular the decision-making faculty of the mind that chooses between the two thought systems. And I think that's Ken's whole purpose in all of his writing as well. So anyway, meanwhile, back at the ranch.
and we're all basically in the same place.
Yeah.
And so this is, truly helpful to, we join together, we talk about it. I can't help but be astounded every day I read the course. Every day I read the course, I read the lessons. I'm like, oh my God, I'm blown away. Oh my God, this is so amazing. Oh my God, I've never seen it before, and I've read it many times. And there's stuff like, I don't know if I ever read this before, because that's how it is.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a few years ago when we moved to the Oregon coast. There was an oceanographer that had some amazing photos and stories. I showed a slideshow in the local Lions Hall of some of the deep sea creatures that lived on the bottom of the ocean. And I'd seen some pretty wild and exotic things before, but he showed us a bunch of things that I'd never seen before. And I was like, wow, that lives on the bottom of the ocean, Marianas Trench level and in between. And it's like pretty astonishing stuff. And then I realized, well, there's how much of the ocean do we not know about? I mean, not only do we not spend much time on the ocean, as far most people, but in the ocean, most of us have, can count in a small number of hours the amount of time we've spent underwater exploring the ocean, right? But that's kind of like the equivalent of our mind. Is there's so much that we don't know about our own mind, that the one collective mind that we all share. And so when we draw from the little droplet that is our single specific mind, I'm petting my cat Sophie, who seems to be wanting attention. Another little specific manifestation. And when we draw from that, we're obviously going to get distorted, limited, and heavily filtered information, right?
Yeah, exactly. And even though you may have read those words before and had thoughts that were similar before, you are not the same person the next time you go back and look, because this changes you. It shifts you, and your mind begins to be open to that bigger picture, that bigger knowledge that is ours intrinsically. It belongs to us. And it's not just the knowledge of the world, because the knowledge of the world is junk. The knowledge of the world and the universe, the planets, the stars, they're nothing compared to reality.
Yeah.
But they seem so big, but I look at the stars, they're tiny. I'm enormous, you know?
Yeah, sounds like a Rumi poem. So,
I
yeah,
read
we've
that
got
on
things a little
book.
backwards, don't we? But that's helpful information to realize how distorted, how limited, and how uh, not in any kind of evil, mean, or sinful way, but just a silly way. How corrupted our information is, because it's necessarily biased, distorted, filtered, twisted, and otherwise incorrect. It's certainly incomplete at best, right?
Upside down and backwards.
Yeah, even if we don't distort much or try not to distort too much, it's certainly heavily filtered. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah. So let's continue. I'll read on if you like.
Sure.
Okay. So Ken just talked about his, for those who just came in, he had recently been divorced, and he had given up on God, and then he started feeling God or presence in his life, and he went to a monastery, and he had an experience. Not explaining what exactly that was, but he just unexpectedly felt totally at home. Um, so he says, the pace of my life now seemed to quicken markedly. I decided while at the monastery that it was God's will that I become a Trappist monk, as well as a Roman Catholic. So I had no interest in the church whatsoever, nor any conscious interest in Jesus, its central figure. Upon my return to the hospital where I was employed, I spoke to the Catholic chaplain who baptized and confirmed me within 3 weeks. In preparation for entering the monastery, church law decreed that I had to wait a year. I decided to leave my job at Thanksgiving and spend the time quietly alone. I felt I should spend part of this time in Israel, and so arranged to go a few days after the holiday. But I'm slightly ahead of the story. This just blows me away that he just all of a sudden, I'm going to become a Catholic and become a monk.
Mhm,
And
mhm. Well, it's interesting, kind of, if you think back of the things, in your life, my life, and everyone else's life, everything has led us up to this point. So all the things that seemed like, how could that fit anything? Um, you know, in retrospect, it's all a perfect tapestry woven together that has led us up to this point where, we're poised to awaken from our dream of separation, right? One thing in particular that comes to mind is when I was studying engineering in University of California, Davis, Northern California. At one point I decided, well, engineering really isn't the whole thing I want to learn. And I was kind of not completely disillusioned with it, but I thought, that seemed like a secondary interest. So I changed my major to applied behavioral science. And then I was, taking some of my engineering classes, but also a lot of courses in psychology. And at the time, everyone was saying, well, why are you doing that? How could those possibly work together? And I realized, well, gee, now what I'm doing mostly is I'm building and maintaining course related websites and using web technology. and and the primary purpose is to integrate community online with technology as well. Okay, well, that kind of all puts in perspective at the time. It's like, what the heck am I doing this for? Right.
it's amazing. It
Yeah.
is really amazing how we are led into these things, and we're given the, I mean, just it's like we fall into it.
Yeah, and with the caveat that the specific things that this Bruce character is doing with his life aren't the important thing. It's really the recognition that there is a greater purpose beyond the form, beyond the specifics.
Yeah, and it's always a big surprise to me to find that. It's like what I'm doing now. My goodness, I never imagined, 20 years ago, if you would have said to me, Lynn, you are going to be like involved completely in this community You're going to spend your whole day and your whole life on the internet talking to people about this Course in Miracles. You're going to be, you're going to have, 3 computers running 24/7, having a radio program that's broadcast and people listen to all over. I would just like, well, I better start studying hard now to figure out how to do that, because I don't know how to do anything like that at all.
Of
But
course,
I
on of course, in
study
what?
every
Of
day.
course, in mackerels? Is this a seafood enterprise?
What the heck? Yeah.
Say what?
But sure enough, man, I mean, it was like, when my life started falling, I mean, think about this. I was an environmental engineer for the Department of Energy. I
Mhm.
had it made. I'm not kidding you. I had it made. Um, I had a great job. I was, an expert in my field, and I mean, I wrote, you know, uh, guides and textbooks and things, and I mean, it was just crazy. I would never ever have thought, I'm going to quit doing this and go out and run a radio station for God, but but that's what I mean. When things started falling apart in my life, things fell down, down, down in really drastic ways. I got fired from 3 jobs in a row. I mean, fired straight up after a stellar career. It was like, suddenly nothing made any sense at all. And after I was, down to the bottom working as a temporary for manpower.
Yeah, I
that
can kind of relate. I was a senior engineer for Grass Valley Group, and suddenly I found myself with downsizing, in Southern Oregon, doing odd jobs like working at a call center at FTD Flowers for Mother's Day, just doing all kinds of crazy stuff.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
like, wait, what's this all about? But it's never about the form, is it? I mean, it's always about, what am I bringing to my mind, and therefore to all minds at each moment, right?
that's right. And just one day I was sitting eating at this temporary job, working for manpower, sitting eating lunch with the one of the bosses, and we were talking, spiritual stuff. And he says, "Oh, hey, have you heard of this book called The Disappearance of the Universe?" Well, I don't know what does that all about? And he had not read it either, but he told me he thought I would like it. So I stopped at the Barnes and Noble on the way home and picked it up. And that was the end of everything.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you,
And
Gary
in person,
Starr.
yeah. Yep. Mhm.
uh, and yeah, so I mean, we don't know. So
Mhm.
this story with Ken and Helen is, I mean, it's equally remarkable. We have
Oh yeah, exactly. And it's all part of a giant tapestry. Then we just, I get fixated on a few threads at most, and usually our thread, in heavy quotes for an hour, right?
exactly, exactly. And I mean, good grief, now here we are together. So do you want to continue reading?
Sure. Shortly
Shortly.
after my, let's say, I think we got there to shortly after my baptism, right?
Yes.
Okay. Shortly after my baptism in September 1972, the chaplain told me that a priest in his religious order was very anxious to meet me. This was my introduction to Father Michael. The circumstances were far more interesting than this, however. Father Michael was a psychologist and had done part of his graduate training under William Thetford and Helen Schucman at the Psychiatric Institute, part of the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. The three of them became good friends, and in fact, Michael was one of the very, very few people with whom Helen and Bill shared A Course in Miracles, even as it was still coming through. One day, Bill was reading John White's The Highest State of Consciousness, that's the title of the book, an anthology in which an article of mine appeared. This was, quote, Mysticism and Schizophrenia, unquote, a paper that was originally meant for my dissertation and was first published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. The article compared and contrasted the mystical experiences of St. Teresa with those of a schizophrenic, the principal point being that schizophrenics were not mystics and mystics were not schizophrenics. Bill showed it to Michael as an example of a psychologist who took the mystical experience seriously, more of a rare occurrence in the mid-60s than it is today. When the baptizing chaplain mentioned to Michael that he had recently baptized a psychologist, a phenomena I think he equated with the imminent announcement of the second coming, Michael recognized my name from the article and expressed interest in meeting me. I called him, set up a time to get together, and he and I soon became fast friends. Shortly before I was to leave for Israel, Michael told me about 2 psychologists he thought I should meet. And so Michael, Helen, Bill, Chip, and I met that Saturday evening. Most of the time, as I recall, was spent in my telling how I came to where I now was in my life. Helen shared a couple of her early experiences, and I remember feeling a particularly close connection with her. At one point in the evening, someone, I think it might have been Michael, mentioned this, quote, book, unquote, that Helen had, quote, written, unquote, which had to do with spiritual development. Bill pointed to a corner in his living room where his copy of the manuscript of the course was kept in 7 black thesis binders. For some reason, I did not feel I should look at them, although it would have been perfectly all right with Helen and Bill if I had done so. The evening ended and I felt that I had just met 2 very holy people, although I obviously could not have recognized then the real importance that they would have in my life. Michael and I drove Helen home to her downtown Manhattan apartment, and Helen mentioned that the name, quote, Wapnick, unquote, was familiar to her, as indeed Schucman was to me. We then realized that Helen knew my ex-wife, Ruth, who had worked for a while at the medical center as a research assistant. I recalled that Ruth had found her immediate supervisor to be quite difficult and had spoken to Helen, a consultant to the project. Ruth had experienced Helen as very supportive and helpful, as she did Bill. Interestingly enough, this association was within the first year or so of the course's transmission. Well, there's enough to pause for a moment and contemplate. So, any thoughts on that, Lynn, at the moment?
Oh, yeah, I have to unmute myself to tell you. Um, that is really interesting that I did not recall or having read this part. I mean, this is great. It's been a long time ago that I read this. I might
Oh,
not
me
have.
too. It's probably a decade at least. Yeah.
I mean, this is amazing how like all these inner, I mean, of course, New York City is a small place. So it's really likely that these people would have come in contact with each other. It's just
Destined to meet, huh?
just amazing how this has all come about, and uh, that uh, he wrote that article, and the priest saw the article, and remembered the name, and then it turns out that they knew each other. It's just wow, small world. I mean, really, it's just very, very cool. Um, you want me to read on?
Sure.
Okay. So after we dropped Helen off, Michael and I continued to his residence where I spent the night. Before we went to sleep, Michael offered me a copy of Helen's book to examine, but again, I did not feel I should look at it. I then went to bed and yet could not fall asleep, a very unusual occurrence for me. Though tired, I tossed and turned for quite some time, trying to figure out why I was having so much difficulty. Finally, I remembered a dream I had had over a year before. In the dream, I was with a group of people who felt very considerably younger than I, who felt were considerably younger than I. I don't know where Barry came from. A very wise middle-aged lawyer then walked in and took me to a different section of the room, which resembled the library, apart from the others. She then presented me with 3 questions, only the first of which is relevant here. I asked what I would, it asked what I would change if I could of any of my childhood experiences. My answer, which proved to be the correct one, was that I would not change anything, since all was the way it should be and the past no longer mattered. I awoke at this point and then finished the dream in a semi-conscious, hypnagogic state. In the dream, which I recognized to be a significant one, This is interesting, by the way. This we'll talk about this semi-conscious hypnagogic states. Okay, in the dream, which I recognize to be a significant one, the woman dash lawyer was a kind of spiritual teacher for whom I had a great deal of respect, and whose respect and approval I had obviously gained as well. Lying in bed at Father Michael's, I suddenly realized that the lawyer was Helen. I barely knew her, but at this point already recognized in Helen the powerful presence of a spiritual authority. Obviously, however, I had no way of knowing then just how complex an individual she was. I became quite peaceful and instantly fell asleep. When I told Michael about it the following morning, he laughed. Uh, of course, Helen would be a lawyer, he said, referring to Helen's keen, analytic, and logically probing mind. So it's interesting that he had a dream, and he woke up from the dream, and then he went back into a semi dreaming state and continued the dream. Have you ever done that?
Mhm.
I mean, that's something that happens to me a lot.
Yeah.
And it's not even like daydreaming, because it's not I'm thinking and wondering things. It's just that the dream is it's like sometimes even when I'm awake,
Mhm.
I will be having a dream, and it's not like a dream of like I'm not thinking about or wondering about or anything. I'll just be seeing things happening, seeing situations and things happening like it, like it's really happening. And I've never understood that. I think it's a sleep disorder, is what I've heard. But it's just interesting to me that that Ken writes about this as if it were just, yep, this is something I did.
Well,
Uh,
I think the hypnagogic state is probably far more common than is usually talked about. I mean, I studied with a teacher named Charlie Tart, who I think is still around, as far as I know, who when I was at university in California, he taught a number of different classes, humanistic psychology. I attended his graduate seminar in Gurdjieff and transpersonal psychology, and the other one was altered states of consciousness, and he literally wrote the book and coined that term, and it was a pretty thick tome, and he didn't expect his students to read the whole thing that quarter, but that was the basic foundation of the material for that class. And in it, he went through just a dazzling array of different, type whole classes of experiences of states of consciousness that certainly aren't our everyday normal waking state. And there's probably a lot of different variations on the hypnagogic state, and I find myself going there sometimes when I'm even in course study groups or classes, and I'll think about what something means, and I'll just kind of uh, go off into a little reverie. Kind of reminded of in on the Sergeant Pepper's album, and then I think it was in the day of a day in the life.
mhm.
Where somebody spoke and I went into a dream, and then it goes into this sort of musical, mystical trance. But I think we do that more than we realize. But then the whole point would be, well, if we can just remember that everything here really is a dream, and all our time is spent in dreaming, and we have a guide through the dream. As I'm going to be meeting at lunch with a fella and his wife who I haven't met, but he just presented our community with a wonderful dream class that I attended for about 8 or 10 weeks. And so we're going to talk outside the class probably about dreams and stuff too, because he's been, quite an authority on that subject for years, and also wrote a book on the subject. But anyway, but it's, the whole premise of this class that he taught was, very much in alignment with the course, is that, all our time is spent in dreaming, and our daytime and nighttime dreams are different in form, but the content really is the same, and as the course perspective is that, anytime we're projecting out onto the world, it's really coming from us. And that was the second premise, is that all the figures in our dream are really aspects of ourselves. And then the third and truly helpful premise is we always have help to get, to wake up from the dream with that awareness in our mind that can look at the dream figures and realize that we're the dreamer, not the dream figures.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's that is our purpose, is to realize that we're dreaming. And so that's why I think, this is the only reason I even stopped on this issue, because, even here, we're being offered another way of looking at our experience, to recognize that we are dreaming. And if you're sleeping and you're dreaming and you recognize that you're dreaming, what happens? Do you continue dreaming or do you wake up? Do you think, oh, I'm dreaming, and wake up? And then maybe you might want to continue the dream in this hypnagogic state. But in general, and people do that. I think they call that lucid dreaming. I'm not sure. But in general, if you're asleep and you're dreaming and you recognize you're dreaming, for me, I always wake up. So, I mean, I think that's probably the point that we're being given, recognize your dreaming. Then you can wake up.
Yeah.
Okay, so you want to continue reading?
Sure, but first I'd like to suggest a revision to a song people might be familiar with, and that could be "If You're Dreaming and You Know It, Clap Your Hands."
Exactly.
How's that? Okay. Why don't you pick up where we left off?
Okay. All right. I left for Israel a few days later, and as it ended up, most of my time was spent in 2 monasteries. I wrote Helen and Bill separate letters in March from the Trappist Abbey of Latrun, outside Jerusalem. My letter to Bill survives, but this first letter to Helen is missing. In it, Helen remarked to me later, I referred to my desire to read her book and spelled it with a capital B, something I never would have consciously done. Moreover, while in Israel, I had 2 dreams relating to Helen's book. In the first, I was standing on a New York City subway platform. I walked over to a garbage can, and there on top was what I knew to be a very holy book, but not one with which I was acquainted. In another dream, I was walking along a beach and found this same holy book in the sand. I eventually left Latrun and went to Lavra Natofa, a small and physically primitive monastic community atop a mountain in the region of Galilee, affording a beautiful view of the northern end of the famous sea. After 2 months and feeling very much at home there, I decided to remain on this mountaintop for an indefinite period of time. But before nestling in, I thought I should visit in the United States to see my family, as well as to look up Helen and Bill. In my letter to Helen announcing my visit, I wrote, since I shall be remaining here quite some time, this made me think of Ramana Maharshi on his mountain. Since I shall be remaining here quite some time, I've decided to come to the United States about a month before returning here and settling in. I plan to arrive somewhere around the weekend of May 12th, 1973, and I hope we can get together soon thereafter. I also look forward very much to reading your book, here spelled with a lowercase b, while in the States. So this is this is pretty funny. So I would go spend the rest of my life on top of a mountain. But first I'll go visit, go home. Good plan. So
God thinks otherwise.
God thinks otherwise.
That was the phrase that infuriated Helen, which I think Ken recounts in his book. Yeah.
I love it every time I see it. I stayed with Michael on my arrival in New York, and shortly thereafterwards, he drove me down to Columbia Presbyterian. Helen's recollection was that I walked into the office and said, hello, here I am. Where's the book?
Where's the beef?
I'm not really sure. Well, I know I was anxious to see this material. I doubt if I would have totally forgotten in my good manners. I would have at least said, hello, how are you? And then where's the, but obviously I could not wait to see Helen's manuscript. Uh, but knowing Ken, he has such an affable nature.
Mhm.
Maybe in those days he was more subdued, but when I knew him, he would have been saying that. Well, here I am. Where is it? Just because he had that sense of humor that was so open and loving.
Mhm.
Uh, so, so you want to continue reading?
Sure. Helen and Bill had adjacent offices within a larger enclosed area, and they sat me down in Bill's office while he went into Helen's. Helen handed me over her two favorite sections, For They Have Come and Choose Once Again, which thus became my introduction to A Course in Miracles. I read eagerly and could scarcely believe what I was reading. Long a lover of Shakespeare, these extremely poetic sections were to me every bit as beautiful as anything the bard had written. And yet I remember exclaiming to Helen and Bill that unlike Shakespeare, these words contained a profound spiritual message. I could not envision a more sublime integration of form and content, equaling in my mind the perfection of Beethoven's C-sharp minor quartet. My memory of the exact sequence of events is hazy, but as I began reading the text from the beginning, I quickly recognized the course as being the most perfect blend of psychology and spirituality that I had ever seen. And that's a pretty good pair of adjectives to describe the course, and a perfect blend of psychology and spirituality. And I'm sure that it did not take me very long to realize that A Course in Miracles was my life's work, as I think probably a lot of people who are listening can relate to. He's certainly,
Exactly.
right?
And actually, a lot of times when people ask me what the Course in Miracles is, I say it's a spiritual psychology.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I oftentimes will say it's not that I'm asked that frequently, but it's what a radical form of forgiveness practice in the best sense of the word radical, something like that.
In the best sense of the word forgiveness.
Well, that too. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay. So let's see. And I'm sure that it did not take me very long to realize that the Course in Miracles was my life's work. Helen and Bill were my spiritual family, and that I was not to become a monk, but to remain in New York with them instead. And then there's a footnote on the bottom of page 11 here. And then Ken says, throughout the book, my additions to quoted material are indicated by brackets as opposed to parentheses, which will always be from the quoted material itself. Well, okay, so that's helpful. And there's some brackets in the quote above. So anyway, not terribly important. Around the year that he
Oh, no.
the letter. Yeah. So anyway, so do you want to pick up on page 12, which is
Sure.
where we left off?
During this period, which seemed to have a life of its own, extending itself from the original 4-week visit to 10, I was dividing most of my time between being with Helen and Bill, together and individually, and my parents. The latter understandably felt considerable discomfort and concern for their nice Jewish son who had joined the enemy camp, who they felt, moreover, had been abducted by a group of very suspect monks. I also traveled around seeing many friends, including a trip to the Abbey of Gethsemane. I thus spent a great deal of time with my new family, going over the entire course of my life, sometimes in great detail. Helen and Bill seemed happy to listen, and it was obviously important for me to share with them who I was, at least I thought I was. In addition, Helen and I began spending a lot of time together, and it was clear that a real bond had been discovered between us. I also spent time alone with Bill and felt a closeness with him as well. All in all, I was somewhat surprised by Helen's and Bill's openness to share with me their difficulties with the course, and the general unhappy state of their lives, not to mention with each other. So now we get the meat.
Yeah, and again, since this is really a reflection of what's going on in our minds, and this book is about everyone, it's like when we recognize, and this is something that Ken said in his commentary about lesson 182 that stuck with me. It's like the purpose of the course is not to make us miserable, but to show us how miserable we've made ourselves by denying the truth and ignoring the promptings of spirit in our mind to forgive what we made up, basically. Belief in separation, to just
Absolutely.
stop taking that seriously.
Yep. Oh gosh. Okay, so thus the honeymoon period for me did not last very long, as the other aspect of Helen and Bill's lives also became painfully at first quite clear. I'm thinking of mommy and daddy are fighting. Um, Helen and Bill were far more complex people than they originally appeared to be. My initial reactions to them were certainly not inaccurate, simply incomplete. The love I felt for Helen and Bill, their dedication to God and A Course in Miracles that I recognized from the beginning, never diminished in my mind, but another dimension in them slowly began to dawn on my awareness. That for a while I attempted to stifle. Here were two kind and wise people, clinical psychologists no less, with whom I was able to speak openly of my relationship with God and Jesus and find total understanding. Moreover, they were, after all, the two persons responsible for this remarkable book that I was beginning to see was the center point of my life, the culmination of my past journey, and foundation for the rest of my time here. But I could also see the enormous difficulty both of them experienced living in the world, seeming appearances and professional accomplishments to the contrary. And above all, I could see that the mess their interpersonal relationship was in. In short, the situation was hardly the spiritual Camelot I thought I had wandered into. Rather, I I was beginning to recognize a complex hotbed of pain and hatred, paradoxically coupled with Helen and Bill's genuine dedication to God and the Course, not to mention a love and concern for each other. So yeah, this is, I think, he would have found that when he went to the monastery too.
I'm
He would have
sure.
found
I'm
that any
sure.
group he went to, he was going to find that in spite of all the peaceful, joyful, whatever appearances,
Yeah, yeah. And in
that
fact,
real people,
Ken,
yeah.
I was going to say, Ken points out that similar phenomena when he refers to a quote that Sigmund Freud mentioned to his daughter Anna when they were out walking through an affluent neighborhood in Vienna when Anna was a child or a young woman, and because he knew a lot of the families that would come to him for therapy, that lived on the street that they were walking along in these mansions, or very well-to-do looking estates, whatever. And he said, that, paraphrasing, that it's not quite so lovely inside those homes as it might appear on the outside, something like that. And which is, basically, again, all of our stories, because we have a divided mind. And then in Ken's wonderful chart, metaphysical, reference, he shows that above the line in his chart is our real nature that we're all seemingly desperately trying to return to, and yet the desperation is needless, because we're already there. That's the only thing that's true. Everything else below that line, which above the line has words that represent the ideas of truth, love, perfection, God, oneness, pure non-duality, all that kind of stuff that's purely non-dual. Uh, anything that doesn't change, capital L love, capital L life, all the things that we would consider eternal, that's our only reality. So anything that does change, anything that could possibly experience differences and alteration and upset, can't be can't be our real nature. And yet that's where we spend most of our time, is trying to figure out how to reconcile all that. And so the way we do that through the course's metaphysics is by seeing that not only did we, appear to have, we appear to have rejected that perfection, the above the line stuff, but we made this decision-making mind that's always going back and forth between the right-minded ideas that lead us back to the truth and the other thought system that the course calls the ego, that just keeps reinforcing the belief in separation. And in order to keep that sacrosanct, not only that the whole thought system of sin, guilt, and fear is protected by telling us to stay out of our mind, because that's so intolerable, we made up an entire physical universe to project the guilt and the blame and the shame out onto, so that we don't have to be personally associated with it, even though it's that personhood that, and the belief in separation itself, that's the problem. Anyway.
Yeah, yeah. And that's why we're in this situation where we're being given the tools to deal with all these seeming conflicts. And through forgiveness, we're able to refocus everything back to its original purpose.
Exactly.
So instead of, this anguish, we experience love. And, Ken himself, and we're going to see this through this book, he went through an enormous shift. I mean, look how shifty he's been already. He went from being a good Jewish boy to, suddenly becoming a Catholic and a monk, and then saying, nope, I'm going to do this now. And, we just don't know the twists and turns that come to us when we open ourselves for
exactly
this experience. And
suddenly he becomes, suddenly, perhaps really, I guess somewhat suddenly, when I look at his early writings, that compared to what I thought was, a gradual awakening, it seemed like Ken really got a whole lot of the course's import right off the bat. When I read like Forgiveness in Jesus, which I bought very shortly after it first came out, and then finally cracked the book open and read it 4 or 5 years ago. but yeah, so, but it does seem like, the calling to be a metaphysical teacher of non-duality, that he obviously went through. There's something else that we just talked about that was kind of related to that, but anyway. Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't have guessed that would have been his life path, but then all of our life paths have taken different turns that have led us in happily unexpected ways that have led to where we're at now, right? That
exactly.
are truly helpful.
Always truly helpful. And this is good news for everybody, whatever situation you're in. Guess what? Woohoo, it's going to change.
Yep. Should I finish the last 3 paragraphs in the
Go ahead.
in the introduction? Okay. This paradox in their relationship, to which I shall return in later chapters, was also reflective of the aforementioned paradox within Helen herself, a phenomena exhibited in her dissociation of 2 almost entirely separate selves, what A Course in Miracles terms the right and wrong minds, representing God and the ego. This paradox, once again, is the central theme in this book, which itself has 3 parts. Part 1 details this conflict within Helen, heaven and Helen, in quotes, as it was manifest in her early years. It is based principally on Helen's autobiography, which I present in as corrected a form as I felt the license to do, interspersed with my own comments. Part 2 largely describes Helen's meeting with Bill and taking down A Course in Miracles, and I draw heavily here upon the personal material given to Helen during the early weeks of the course's scribing. In addition, I cite relevant excerpts from Helen's dreams, as well as from letters Helen wrote to Bill and notes from Bill's journal. In part 3, I return to the period of my association with Helen and Bill, which basically began in 1973, specifically calling upon my personal reminiscences of Helen to discuss her 2 sides and the ultimate resolution of this conflict. Once this duality was transcended, only the unity of her one self, with a capital S, remained. Thus, parts 1 and 2 span Helen's childhood to the fall of 1972 when she completed taking down the course. Part 3 of the book covers the final period of her life, 1973 to 1981, when I was so intimately connected with her. And then there's a footnote at the bottom of this page too that says Helen and Bill had appointed, in quotes, appointed me archivist of all the material related to the Course in Miracles, including Helen's original notebooks and all subsequent typings of the Course manuscript. This material has been copyrighted by me under the title, quote, The Unpublished Writings of Helen Schucman, Volumes 1 through 22, unquote. These writings also include Helen's above-mentioned autobiography, correspondence between Helen and Bill, Helen and me, Helen's dreams, undergraduate and graduate school term papers, etc. I quote extensively from these writings in the chapters to follow. And a personal note, when I was helping Tam Morgan put together, with incredible technical help from Felix Alcala, the current Foundation for Inner Peace website, ACIM.org, several years ago, which I really haven't touched for several years. I learned through Tam Morgan, who still is doing very active and doing weekly podcasts with Matt McCabe, Miracle Voices, which I recommend. I've been a guest on their show a couple of times, and a lot of great information on that one. And then they're also doing monthly webinars and that kind of stuff. Great, great work. And anyway, Tam mentioned to me that when Ken had passed, previously Judy had inherited a lot of the personal memorabilia from both Helen and Bill. And then when Ken had passed, she acquired quite a bit more things that, felt needed to be connected with the FIP, that sister foundation for A Course in Miracles. So my understanding is that Tam still has, and the Foundation for Inner Peace in Northern California still has an enormous, collection of material that is just barely gone through of from all what I call the Fab Four, if you Helen and Bill and Ken and Judy. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. I know the Foundation for A Course in Miracles has been publishing a lot of things that were incomplete, unpublished works, and usually about once a month releases a recording or two. And if you go to facim.org and look under their news, you can subscribe to updates and learn about the new releases that are still coming out, like almost a decade after. I think it's coming up on a decade after Ken's passing. So
Isn't that
anyway.
something? Yeah, he's still prolific in his death.
Yeah.
I mean, he was so prolific that I know many people who, I know one person I think who wrote a letter to Ken almost every day, and Ken wrote him back a letter every day, not just a thanks for the note, see you later, real in-depth.
Oh, very, very in depth, very in depth. Yeah.
Every day.
And he didn't die, as he points out, as Jesus does in his course. Yeah.
Yeah,
So if we've never been born, how could we die?
Yeah, it's amazing. And I attended the last webinar, the one about basically they wanted to talk about the parts of the course that didn't get in there about sex. But I thought it was going to be a lot more in depth with some other things about gender and that type of stuff, but we didn't really get into that. But it was really interesting and very, if you are not signed up, I can put the links and you can go to their get on their mailing list, and I get announcements all the time from FACIM at acim.org also. But yeah, that's why I get a lot of my I play Ken Wapnick workshops, and that's where I get them from.
Yep. Great resource.
For $13 you can get a download of a 4-hour workshop or something. That's a pretty good deal.
Yeah. Well, as always, thanks again, Lynn, for sharing an hour with me on Saturday mornings. And now we're ready to read part 1, the early years, next week. So looking forward to that.
Wahoo. Thank you so much, Bruce. And I'm going to stop this recording. Yep.